It is the dead middle of the night, and the city of Salvador is holding its breath. You are standing in a narrow street in the old lower town, close to the harbor, where the buildings lean in over your head, and the only light is a single oil lamp guttering in a window somewhere above you. It is January, so the air is warm and thick and smells of salt and smoke and the sea, and you are not supposed to be out here. Nobody is. There is a law about that. Africans do not walk these streets after dark, not without a master, not without a paper, not without risking the lash. And yet the street is not empty. Coming toward you quietly out of the dark are men. Dozens of them, and behind them more, moving with a purpose that makes the hair stand up on your arms. They are dressed in long white garments, clean and pale as ghosts in the gloom, and as one of them passes close you see, sewn to the cloth at his chest, a small folded packet of paper. He is wearing writing. He is wearing words. And you realize with a jolt that goes right through you that these men are not lost, and they are not drunk, and they are not afraid. They know exactly where they are going and exactly what they mean to do tonight. In a few hours, this quiet street is going to be the loudest place in the Americas. Because you have wandered, my friend, into the opening minutes of the largest rebellion of enslaved people that the New World would ever see. And almost nobody outside of Brazil has ever heard of it. Let me tell you who these men in white were, and what they wanted, and why the whole slaveholding world would tremble at their memory for the rest of the century. Here, pull the lamp a little closer, and let me sit with you a while, because this is a story I have carried for a long time and I want to tell it properly. My name is Joaquim. For the better part of 40 years, I stood at the front of a Brazilian classroom with a stub of chalk in my hand, trying to convince restless teenagers that the past was not a dull gray list of dates but a living thing, full of people every bit as clever and as frightened and as brave as they were. I am retired now, more or less, though a teacher never really stops. We just trade the classroom for a chair and whoever is kind enough to listen. And of all the stories I ever taught in Bahia, this is the one that made the room go completely still, because it takes almost everything people think they know about slavery, that the enslaved were broken, ignorant, helpless, without a world of their own, and it turns it upside down. I am going to be honest with you the whole way through. Honest about what these men achieved, honest about what it cost them, and honest, above all, that in several places the historians still argue fiercely about what really happened and why, and where they argue, I will stop and tell you so, because a story like this one has earned the truth. So, let us begin with a word. A single, strange, beautiful word that most Brazilians could not define for you even today. Malê. Malê. In the history books, the events of that January night are called the Revolta dos Malês, the Malê Revolt. And the word tells you almost the whole secret of the thing, if you know where it comes from. It comes, most scholars believe, from the Yoruba language of West Africa, from the word Imail, which simply means a Muslim, a follower of Islam. That is who the Malês were. Not a tribe, not a nation in the way we usually mean it, a faith. The men in white in that street were, many of them, devout Muslims, thousands of miles from home, praying 5 times a day to a god the men who owned them had never heard of and would not have understood. Sit with that for a second, because it is not the picture the schoolbook painted for me when I was a boy. When I was young, we were taught about slavery in Brazil as a great gray mass of suffering. And the suffering was real, please understand me. It was as vast and as terrible as anything in human history. But the people were shown to us as a crowd, a labor force, an economic fact. not as men and women who arrived on these shores already carrying entire worlds inside them, languages, laws, sciences, poetry, and religion. The Malês were, many of them, West Africans from the great Muslim societies of what we now call Nigeria and the lands around it, Hausa people, and Yoruba people, whom the Brazilians called Nagô. They came from cities with schools and scholars and libraries, and the slave ships did not empty their minds when they filled the holds. Think for a moment about where they had been torn from. In those same years in West Africa, there had been great religious wars and upheavals, the rise of powerful Muslim states, the shattering of old kingdoms, waves of holy war and conquest. Many of the people sold into slavery and shipped to Bahia were prisoners of exactly those conflicts. Soldiers, scholars, city dwellers, some of them men who had themselves been on the winning and the losing sides of wars fought partly over faith. They did not arrive in Salvador as blank, bewildered innocents. A good number of them arrived as people who already knew from the inside what it meant to organize, to fight, to hold a community together under a banner. The empire that bought them thought it was buying muscle. It was, in some cases, buying the veterans of other men's revolutions. And here is the part that stops people cold, the part that gives me a shiver every time I say it out loud. Many of these men could read and write in Arabic. Now, I need you to understand what that meant in the Brazil of 1835, because from where you are sitting it might not sound like much. In that world, in that colony-turned empire built on slavery, teaching an enslaved person to read was not merely rare. It was, to the men who ran things, close to unthinkable, because they understood in their bones that a person who can read is a person who can plan, who can write a letter, who can carry a message across a city without saying a word out loud, who can pass a secret. The whole system rested on keeping people ignorant, isolated, and unable to combine. And here, in the heart of it, was a community of Africans quietly running Quranic schools in the back rooms of Salvador, teaching one another to read the holy book, copying out prayers and verses by hand, in a script not one of their masters could decipher. The little paper packets I told you about, sewn to their robes, those were part of this world too. They were amulets, folded papers carrying verses and prayers written in Arabic, worn for protection, in the belief that the holy words would turn away the blade and the bullet. To the men who owned them, if they ever found one, it looked like a scrap of gibberish, a bit of African superstition. It was, in fact, scripture. It was literacy itself, hidden in plain sight, hanging around the necks of men who were supposed to know nothing at all. A student of mine once put up her hand and asked me, "Professor, if they could write, why did nobody notice?" And I told her the truth, which is that they did notice, eventually, and that noticing terrified them more than any weapon, because a whip answers a strong back. But what do you do about a mind? Picture the double life these men and women were living. By day, they were what Salvador demanded they be: porters bent under sacks on the docks, water carriers, cooks, cane cutters, market women, the invisible hands that made a slave city run. They wore the face the masters wanted to see: obedient, unremarkable, empty. And then in the evenings, in rented rooms and backyards and the houses of freed friends, that face came off. They gathered to pray toward a city thousands of miles away that most of them would never see again. They kept the fast. They studied. Older teachers sat with younger men and traced the letters. They kept, in the belly of a Catholic slaveholding empire that thought it had erased them, an entire parallel world of worship and learning and mutual care. It is one of the most quietly astonishing things I know of in all of history, this refusal, night after night, to become the nothing they were told to be. So let me set the stage properly, because place matters here. Salvador, the capital of the province of Bahia, on the northeastern coast of Brazil. In 1835, it was one of the great slave cities of the entire hemisphere. For 3 centuries, the sugar of Bahia had been grown and cut and boiled by enslaved Africans, and the port of Salvador had swallowed a river of human beings coming across the Atlantic, more than almost anywhere else on Earth. By the time of our story, a huge share of the people in and around the city were African-born or of African descent, enslaved on the plantations and in the city houses, and also, and this matters, a growing number of freed men and women, Africans who had bought or been granted their liberty, and now lived a precarious half-life in the streets of the town, working as porters and craftsmen and market sellers, free in name but hemmed in on every side. And this was not a calm place. I want to be careful and accurate here. The Bahia of those years had seen revolt after revolt after revolt. For decades there had been risings and plots and flights and rebellions, especially among the Hausa and Nagô Africans. The province simmered like a pot with the lid held down by force. The Malê Revolt did not come out of a clear sky. It was the largest and most organized eruption of a pressure that had been building and failing and building again for a generation. The people of Salvador, black and white, went to sleep in a city that everyone knew at some level was sitting on a fault line. They simply did not know the night. Now let me introduce you to the men at the center of it, because this was not a leaderless spasm of rage. It had teachers and organizers and a structure, and the men who held it together are worth knowing by name. At the heart of the Malê community were the religious teachers, the men the community revered as masters of the faith and the word. In the sources they appear under the title Alufa, the Muslim teacher, the cleric, the keeper of the writing. These were the men who ran the little schools, who taught the children and the grown men their letters and their prayers, who wrote out the amulets by hand. They were, in a community forbidden to have leaders, the closest thing to leaders it had, and they were at the very core of the plot. Among the names that come down to us, and I give them to you because they deserve to be spoken aloud, was an enslaved teacher the Brazilians recorded as Pacifico Licatan, a revered Alufa who was, at the time of the revolt, being held in the city jail, and whom the rebels reportedly hoped to free. There were freedmen involved as well, African men who had already won their liberty, and now chose to risk it entirely. Names like Belchior and Gaspar, and a man remembered as Elesbao du Carmo, known also by his African name, Dandara. And there was a house, a humble dwelling belonging to a freedman called Manol Caliphate, a man whose trade, the caulking of ships, had given him his very surname, a house that served as a meeting place, a node in the network, where men gathered in the last hours to pray and to prepare. Keep that house in your mind. It matters more than you would think in just a few minutes' time. I will be honest with you that the records of all this were written by the men who crushed the revolt, drawn out of prisoners through interrogation and trial, so the portraits are partial and sometimes cruel, but the shape of the thing is clear enough. This was a movement with a spine of faith and teaching running straight down the middle of it, and the men in white had chosen the night with great care. Here is a detail that historians have argued over for a long time, and I will lay the argument out honestly rather than pretend it is settled. The revolt was timed for the closing days of Ramadan, the holy month in which Muslims fast from dawn to dusk, a time of intense prayer, discipline, and community. Many scholars believe the rebels chose this moment deliberately. that the fast had drawn the faithful together, sharpened their resolve, and given the rising a spiritual charge, a sense that they moved with God at their backs. Some point to the great festival at the end of Ramadan as the intended signal. The plan, as best the records let us reconstruct it, was ambitious almost beyond belief. The rebels meant to rise in the small hours, to take the city, to free the enslaved, and to strike at the soldiers and the symbols of the power that held them down. There were leaders, older, respected men, some of them Muslim teachers, men the community called by titles of learning and faith. Word had been passed in Arabic notes and by trusted mouths from house to house, across the free and the enslaved alike. It was, for its moment, a genuine conspiracy, coordinated, literate, and disciplined by a shared faith. But conspiracies are fragile things, and this one in its final hours sprang a leak, because the rising did not begin the way it was meant to. By most accounts, the plan was betrayed at the last moment. Word reached the authorities that something was coming that very night. A warning, passed by frightened people who knew, reached the police and the provincial government just in time for them to begin to stir, to send patrols out into the dark, to start knocking on doors. And so the rebels, realizing they had been discovered, were forced to move early, before everything was ready, before all their people could gather. Imagine the agony of that moment. Months of secret work, the plan of your life, the one chance at freedom for you and everyone you love. And suddenly the enemy is awake and you have to go now in the dark, half assembled or not at all. They went. In the deep night of the 24th into the 25th of January, 1835, the men in white poured out into the streets of Salvador, and the largest urban slave rebellion in the history of the Americas began, a few hours ahead of its own schedule, and already, though they could not yet know it, at a terrible disadvantage. And here is where that house comes back, because by most accounts, the very first blow of the rebellion fell at the house of Manol Caliphate. When the warned authorities began to move through the city, some of them came to that gathering place, and the men inside, cornered, knowing the game was up, chose not to be taken quietly. They burst out of the house and into the street, into the officials come to seize them, and in that first clash the revolt announced itself to Salvador. From that doorway, it spilled outward into the dark lanes of the town. What began as a careful plan became, in an instant, a thing of open fire and running feet. What followed was a running battle through the streets of the old city. The rebels' historians most often estimate somewhere around 600 of them actually took up the fight, though I will tell you plainly that the numbers vary from source to source, and you should hold any single figure loosely. The rebels moved through the town, trying to gather more men, trying to reach comrades held in the barracks and the jail, clashing with the patrols that were now hunting them. They fought with what they had, some swords and knives and a few firearms, against soldiers with muskets and cavalry, and the whole armed apparatus of a slaveholding state that had spent 3 centuries preparing for exactly this nightmare. They were brave. By every account, they fought with a discipline and a courage that shook the men who faced them. In the dark and the confusion they had some early success. Some skirmishes went their way. But they had lost the one thing they could not afford to lose, which was surprise. The authorities, warned, had time to muster police, army soldiers, and armed civilians, the slaveholders themselves and their agents, all converging on the rising. And as the night wore toward dawn, the weight of organized force began to tell. I am not going to dwell on the killing, because this is not a story that needs blood painted across it to matter, and because the men who died deserve better than to be a spectacle. but you should know the shape of it. Somewhere in the region of dozens of rebels were killed in the fighting and its immediate aftermath. Again, the exact number is not certain and the sources disagree, along with several on the other side. Within hours, before the sun was fully up, it was over. The rebellion that had been years in the making, and that terrified an empire, was crushed in a single night. And then came the reckoning, and it was vast, and it was cold. The authorities of Bahia did not treat this as an ordinary crime. They understood correctly that they had brushed up against something that could have swallowed the whole province, and they responded with the full machinery of fear. In the weeks and months that followed, hundreds of people were arrested and put on trial. Enslaved and freed Africans dragged before the courts, their homes searched, their papers seized. And it was in those searches, going through the possessions of the accused, that the authorities found the thing that frightened them more than the swords: the writing. Arabic texts, prayer boards, amulets, notes and boards covered in a script they could not read, evidence of a whole hidden literate world they had never suspected was there, running underneath their feet. The punishments were meant to terrify. By most accounts, a handful of the leaders were executed. Many more were sentenced to floggings, brutal public whippings, some of hundreds of lashes meant to be witnessed. Others were sentenced to prison, to hard labor. And a great number were sentenced to something that carried its own particular cruelty: deportation. They were to be shipped back across the Atlantic to Africa, not as a mercy, not as a return home, but as a removal, an expulsion of people judged too dangerous to remain. Some of those deported had been born in Africa. Some of the freed among them were being torn from the only life they had built. Brazil was, in effect, trying to vomit up a population it had swallowed and now feared. And there is a strange, bittersweet coda to that. A number of Africans, over the years that followed, made their way back across the ocean to West Africa, some deported, some leaving of their own will as the ground grew ever harder under them in Bahia. And among the coastal cities of West Africa, there grew communities of returnees who carried Brazil back with them, in their names, their cooking, their buildings, their faith. The Atlantic, which had only ever run one way in chains, began, in a small and painful trickle, to run the other. But the response that tells you the most, the one I always lingered on with my students, because it speaks so loudly about the true nature of the fear, was in the laws that came after. Because the province did not simply punish the guilty, it legislated against a whole people, and against a whole faith. In the wake of the revolt, Bahia and other authorities moved to tighten the screws on Africans in general, and on Islam in particular. There were new restrictions and heavier surveillance on the movements and the gatherings of Africans, efforts to suppress Muslim practice, to watch the free Africans with new suspicion, to break up the very networks of teaching and worship that had made the revolt possible. The message was unmistakable. It was not enough to defeat the rebels. The state wanted to reach into the community and pull out the roots, the literacy, the religion, the solidarity, the things that had allowed the men in white to become something more than a scattered crowd of the enslaved. And think about what that tells you. A society reveals what it truly fears by what it moves to forbid. Bahia in 1835 was not, in the end, most afraid of African bodies. It had always been willing to face those, whip in hand. What it could not tolerate was African minds, organized, literate, faithful, capable of planning in a language the masters could not read. The revolt was crushed in a night. But the fear it planted lasted for years, and it rippled far beyond Bahia, up and down the coast, into the great houses and the government halls of the whole slaveholding empire, where men lay awake wondering what else was being written in the dark, in a script they would never learn. You can see that fear working in the numbers of the trials themselves. This was not a handful of prosecutions. The authorities put hundreds of people through their courts, questioning, sentencing, combing through a whole community for anyone who might have known. The scale of the reaction is itself a kind of confession. You do not build a machine that sighs to crush something small. And the tremor carried far beyond that one January. For years afterward, up and down the coast, the very mention of the Malês was enough to tighten a slaveholder's grip and quicken his pulse. The men in white had lost the battle in the streets before dawn, but the fear they left behind them won a longer, stranger victory that no one had planned. It lodged itself permanently in the imagination of the people who had thought themselves untouchable. Now I promised you honesty, and here is where I must keep that promise most carefully, because this is the ground on which the historians still argue, and I would be lying to you if I pretended the meaning of this night were simple or agreed. The great question, the one that scholars have gone back and forth over for decades. The Brazilian historian João José Reis wrote the definitive study of it, and even he lays the tensions out rather than resolving them all, is this. What really was the Malê Revolt about? Was it first and foremost a religious uprising, a jihad, a rising of Muslims moved by their faith, timed to Ramadan, fought under the banner of Islam? Or was it, first and foremost, an ethnic movement, a rising of particular African peoples, the Hausa and the Nagô, drawing on bonds of language and origin? Or was it, above all and beneath everything, simply a revolt against slavery itself? Enslaved people reaching, by any means and under any banner, for the freedom that was theirs by right. And the honest answer, the answer I give you as a teacher who has read the arguments and weighed them, is that it was tangled up in all three, and that serious, careful people still disagree about which thread was the strongest. The faith was real. The ethnic bonds were real. The unbearable fact of slavery was real, and underneath it all, you should be suspicious of anyone, including me, who tells you they have flattened this night into a single tidy cause. History is rarely so obliging, and the people who lived it did not check a box explaining their motives before they walked into that street. They carried faith and origin and the raw human hunger to be free, all at once, all together, into the dark, and they paid for it all at once, all together. So, let me gather this up the way I always did at the end of the lesson, when the light was going and the room had gone quiet, because there is something in here I want you to carry out with you, and it is not really about one night in Bahia. For a long time I thought the most important thing about the Malê Revolt was that it happened at all, that in the deepest pit of the largest slave society in the Americas, hundreds of people found the courage and the organization to rise. And that is extraordinary, and it is true. But the older I get, the more I find myself sitting with a different piece of it. Not the swords, the paper, those little folded amulets, those backroom schools, those verses copied out by hand in a script the whole weight of the empire could not read. Because that is what the masters truly feared, in the end, not that their slaves could fight, but that their slaves could think and read and write, and pass a message no one else could understand. They spent centuries trying to convince themselves that the people they owned were empty vessels, minds like blank ground. And one night in January proved, beyond any argument, that they had been living all along on top of a hidden world, rich and literate and alive, that they had never bothered to see, And here is where I turn it gently toward you, because I did not walk you through all of this to leave you with a date and a shudder. Every society in every age decides which minds it will bother to see and which it will look straight through. It is a very old and a very human habit to mistake the silence of the powerless for emptiness, to assume that the person who is not permitted to speak has nothing to say. The Malês are a warning against that habit, written across the sky of one night in letters no one can now unsee. There are whole worlds of thought and dignity and longing moving, right now, in people you have been taught to look through. The only real question is whether you notice them before some night forces you to. I genuinely want to know what you think, so do me the honor of telling me 2 things down in the comments. First, and be honest, because I suspect I know the answer and I want to see how far this forgetting runs beyond my own country. Before tonight, had you ever heard of the Malê Revolt of 1835? And second, the harder one, think of a time, in your own reading or your own life, when you discovered that people you had been taught to underestimate turned out to carry a whole world you never suspected. Tell me about it. I read the comments, and I would love to learn something from you for a change. And if this story was a stranger to you until tonight, if the men in white, with scripture sewn to their robes, walking into the dark against an empire, were never once mentioned in any classroom of yours, then do me one small kindness and subscribe, because there is a whole country full of buried chapters like this one, brave and inconvenient and left out of the schoolbook on purpose. And I mean to dig up every last one of them and set it back in the light where it belongs. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for pulling the lamp closer. And the next time someone tells you the enslaved had no world of their own, you remember the paper. You remember that they could read.